48 hours after my daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and said, "Stop calling us, old man." She called me instead. Her voice was barely recognizable. The confident woman who used to speak to everyone as though she already owned the world sounded like someone standing at the edge of a cliff. "Walter." For a long moment, she couldn't even finish the sentence. Finally, she whispered, "What did you do?" I looked down at the single sheet of paper resting quietly on my desk. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't a police report. It wasn't even a termination notice. It was simply a confirmation from the Ohio State Board acknowledging that my request had been officially processed. Outside my office window, 3 state investigators were walking toward the front entrance of the funeral home my late wife and I had spent 40 years building. The parking lot looked strangely crowded. Black sedans, corporate attorneys, government vehicles, people carrying briefcases. Inside the conference room, my son hadn't stopped pacing for nearly an hour. The multi-million-dollar acquisition he and his wife had spent years arranging had just been suspended indefinitely. Across town, somewhere I would never see, a luxury real estate agent was probably making a phone call explaining why the waterfront house my daughter-in-law had already chosen would never belong to her. Everything she had been planning. Every purchase she had already imagined. Every celebration she had already rehearsed. All of it had begun collapsing because of one decision. One completely legal decision. One signature. I picked up the phone again. "Kendra," I said quietly, "I didn't do anything to you. I didn't destroy anything. I only removed something that no longer belonged there." Silence. For the first time since she married my son 15 years earlier, she had no clever response. No insult. No manipulation. No confidence. Only breathing. Heavy. Uneven. Frightened. The strange thing was that I hadn't signed anything to destroy her life. I had only signed something that removed my own name from hers. Everything else collapsed on its own. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder whether any of this could have been avoided. Maybe if my son had answered just one phone call. Maybe if someone had remembered that a family business isn't just buildings, licenses, and bank accounts. Maybe if my daughter-in-law had understood that a good name is worth more than any corporate buyout. But greed has a way of convincing people they've already earned money that doesn't belong to them. It blinds them. It makes tomorrow's fortune feel like today's cash. And eventually, it makes them believe the people who built everything have become nothing more than inconvenient signatures waiting at the bottom of a page. She thought I was just an old man she could ignore. She never imagined that the old man she dismissed was the only thing holding her entire future together. This story didn't begin with an investigation. It didn't begin with missing money. It didn't even begin with a business deal. It began on a cold September morning when I found a thick manila envelope sitting quietly on my desk and decided to call my son. The manila envelope sitting on the mahogany desk felt entirely too thick, and it smelled faintly of imported jasmine perfume. That aggressive floral scent had no place in the quiet, respectful air of a family funeral home in Upper Arlington, Ohio. It belonged exclusively to my son's wife, Kendra. I rested a hand on the stiff paper, registering the early autumn chill that had seeped into the office overnight. The radiator hissed a low, metallic rhythm in the corner. A familiar comfort on a cold September morning. I am 72 years old, and my name, Walter Hayes, has been on the front door of this business for decades. As the founder and licensed qualifying funeral director, I usually know every single piece of paper that passes through these walls. I slid the heavy pages out of the envelope, and the crisp sound echoed in the empty room. My fingers traced over the bold heading on the very first page. It was a closing checklist for a corporate acquisition. Someone was preparing a multi-million-dollar sale of the business, and right there on the checklist, my active professional license was listed as an ongoing asset required to close the deal. They had not mentioned a single word about this to me. I stepped back from the daily management 8 years ago so my son Nathan could take over the operations. He is 44 now, and I always wanted to trust him. His wife Kendra, at 41, became the chief operating officer shortly after they married 15 years ago. She brought in expensive suits, luxury cars, and endless talk of modernizing our revenue streams. I let them run the day-to-day tasks. But I kept my license active because replacing me would require years of regulatory approvals. I needed to hear Nathan explain this document. Reaching across the cold wood of the desk, I picked up the heavy receiver of the office phone and dialed his cell number. The dial tone buzzed flatly in my ear before the ringing started. 1 ring, 2, 3. It went straight to voicemail. I pressed the button and dialed again. Nathan was usually awake by dawn, and we always used to have coffee early in the morning to discuss the upcoming services. That was before Kendra decided they needed to live in a sprawling house far away from the funeral home. I called a third time, and my chest tightened slightly. I was not furious yet, just a father trying to understand why his life's work was being quietly packaged for a corporate buyer without a single conversation. On the fourth ring, the line finally clicked open. "Nathan," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "He is busy." Kendra's voice came through the speaker. She had answered on a hands-free device, and in the background, I could clearly hear the clinking of fine china and the loud hum of an expensive espresso machine. "I need to speak to my son," I told her. "I am standing in the office, and I am looking at a commercial transfer agreement." The clinking stopped abruptly. A heavy silence stretched over the phone line. I waited for her to pass the phone to Nathan, needing my boy to explain why they were secretly selling the legacy I had built from absolutely nothing. Instead, my daughter-in-law let out a short, irritated sigh. "Stop calling us, old man." The call disconnected immediately, leaving a sharp beep echoing in my ear. I stood alone in the quiet office. The plastic receiver felt heavy and cold in my palm. Carefully, I placed it back onto the cradle, listening to the soft click of the mechanism. To my son's wife, I was no longer family, but simply an annoyance she had to tolerate. She wanted me out of their lives completely, and that much was perfectly clear. What the woman did not realize was that her entire corporate payout depended exclusively on the signature of the old man she had just insulted. The metal drawer of the licensing cabinet slid open with a familiar heavy scrape. Inside sat the state board records, smelling faintly of aging paper and dust. My name anchored every single operating permit in that drawer. Ruth Collins stepped into the room, holding a thick stack of morning mail. At 66, the office manager had guarded our front desk longer than Nathan had been alive. "The state needs you to sign the annual renewal," Ruth said, setting a blue folder gently on the desk. Nathan asked about transferring the qualifying license to his name last month, but I reminded him about the legal hurdles. Replacing me was never a matter of simply filling out a form. State regulations demanded years of specific apprenticeship and rigorous board certifications to become a qualifying funeral director. My son had never put in the required hours, and hiring an outside director would trigger a massive regulatory audit. Keeping my name on the wall remained the only way this business could legally operate, let alone be sold to a corporate buyer. The heavy oak front door swung open, bringing a gust of crisp autumn air into the quiet lobby. Kendra walked in. The woman did not wear the muted, respectful tones expected in our line of work. A tailored coat that easily cost more than a standard burial casket draped over her shoulders, and designer heels clicked aggressively against the hardwood floor. Pressing a sleek silver phone to her ear, my son's wife completely ignored my presence. "Just put the offer in," Kendra told the person on the line, her voice echoing too loudly in the solemn space. "We will close the business sale before Halloween. The liquidity event is entirely guaranteed." Pacing near the viewing parlor, the chief operating officer admired her reflection in the dark window glass. A brand-new, imported SUV sat idling in the driveway outside, its exhaust pluming in the cold morning air. For months, I had watched her accumulate luxury leather bags, expensive jewelry, and weekend trips to coastal resorts. The sudden influx of personal wealth never made sense for a Midwestern family funeral home. But Nathan always claimed they were simply expanding their profit margins through modern efficiency. Ending her call, my daughter-in-law finally looked my way. Her eyes swept over my worn wool cardigan, landing on the blue state board folder in my hands. "Are you still hovering around here?" Kendra asked, her tone dripping with polite venom. "Nathan handles all the compliance now. You really do not need to trouble yourself with the paperwork anymore." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked into the executive suite, pulling the frosted glass door shut behind her. The brass lock clicked firmly into place. I stood alone in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the silence of the building. Then, I walked back to my desk and opened the morning mail Ruth had left for me. Most of it consisted of routine vendor invoices, but a bank statement for the restricted prepaid trust account had been mixed in by mistake. Those funds belonged to grieving families who had paid in advance for future services, and the law required strict preservation of every single cent. I adjusted my reading glasses and scanned the printed ledger. The numbers did not line up. A massive deduction sat near the bottom of the page, labeled vaguely as an advanced management consulting fee. There was no vendor number, no supporting invoice, and no project description, just a massive withdrawal from a protected prepaid trust account. No such vendor existed in our approved records. I ran my index finger down the column, finding a second transfer, and then a third. Each recurring payment drained thousands of dollars away from the protected family trusts. My heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I did not march down the hall to demand answers. I did not pound my fists on Kendra's locked door. Instead, I carefully walked over to the copy machine, placed the bank statement on the glass, and pressed the green button. A bright light swept across the page, capturing the evidence. I needed to know exactly who owned Northbridge before I said another word. The accounting office sat at the very end of the back hallway. Fluorescent lights hummed a low, steady note against the acoustic ceiling tiles. Thomas, our lead bookkeeper for over a decade, sat hunched over a glowing monitor. A half-empty mug of black coffee rested next to a tall stack of reconciliation reports. I walked in and placed the copied bank statement flat on his desk. My index finger tapped the line item for Northbridge Operations LLC. "Thomas," I said, keeping my tone quiet and conversational. "I need the vendor file for this specific company." The bookkeeper looked down at the paper, and his shoulders instantly stiffened. All the color drained from his face. He did not reach for the document or pull up a search window on his computer. Instead, the man just swallowed hard and glanced nervously toward the open door behind me. "That is an executive account," Thomas muttered, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. "Kendra handles those directly. I just reconcile the monthly totals." "These funds came from the prepaid family trusts," I reminded him gently. "The law requires us to maintain those balances exactly. I want to see the transfer approvals." Sweat beaded on the bookkeeper's forehead. Thomas reached into a bottom drawer, his hands shaking slightly, and pulled out a thin red folder. He slid the cardboard across the desk without making eye contact. I opened the cover. Inside sat a dozen wire transfer authorization forms. My eyes skipped past the printed amounts and landed directly on the bottom line of the first page. A messy scrawl sat right above the approval date. The signature looked familiar. I stared at it for several long seconds. No, it could not be. A cold weight dropped into the pit of my stomach. I turned to the second page, hoping the first was a simple mistake, but the exact same signature glared back at me. Then, a third time. Only then did I accept the handwriting. Nathan, my own son. He had personally authorized every single withdrawal from the protected client funds. Footsteps clicked sharply against the linoleum floor out in the hallway. Kendra appeared in the doorway, her presence instantly suffocating the small room. The chief operating officer crossed her arms, and her manicured nails tapped an impatient rhythm against the expensive fabric of her sleeve. "Is there a problem in here?" Kendra asked. Her gaze locked strictly onto Thomas. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the stale air. Thomas shrank back in his chair and quickly looked down at his keyboard. "No problem at all. Walter was just leaving." My daughter-in-law shifted her attention to me, offering a tight smile that completely failed to reach her eyes. "Nathan and I need the final quarterly projections ready by noon, Thomas. Make sure you prioritize our requests above everything else." She turned and walked away, her designer heels echoing down the corridor. The message was entirely clear. Thomas worked for her now, and keeping his job meant keeping her secrets. I closed the red folder and picked it up. The accountant opened his mouth to protest, but I raised a hand, stopping him before he could speak. Taking the documents, I walked quietly back to my own office and shut the heavy oak door. My chest ached with a deep and hollow pain that had nothing to do with my age. Finding Kendra stealing from the business was one thing, but discovering Nathan acting as her willing accomplice shattered something fundamental inside me. I raised that boy to respect the grieving families who trusted us in their darkest moments. We used to stand together in the viewing parlor, and I would tell him that an honest name was the only currency that truly mattered. Now, he was trading our family legacy to fund a luxury lifestyle. Sitting heavily in my leather chair, I set the red folder down next to my computer. If Nathan was signing fraudulent wire transfers, I needed to know exactly how deep this betrayal went. I reached for the mouse, waking up the monitor, and logged into the master administrative server. If they were careless enough to leave a paper trail on the accountant's desk, they were probably careless enough to talk about it in writing. I opened the company email archive, typed my son's name into the search bar, and pressed enter. The search bar blinked against the stark white background of the email archive. Typing my son's name took more effort than it should have, and my fingers felt stiff against the plastic keys. I filtered the results by messages sent directly to Kendra over the past 6 months, hitting the enter key and waiting for the screen to load. Dozens of internal threads populated the window. The most recent chain sat right at the top, dated just 2 days ago. Nathan had forwarded a voicemail transcript I left him regarding the upcoming autumn service schedules. I clicked on the bold text, and the message expanded. My son had not written a thoughtful response or offered to call me back. He had simply sent my message to his wife with a single punctuation mark, questioning what to do with me. Kendra had replied 3 minutes later. Her response consisted of two simple words: handle him. My jaw tightened, and I scrolled down to the next message. This one contained a summary of a recent budget meeting. Nathan had added a note at the bottom, complaining that I was spending too much time near the accounting desk. The reply from my daughter-in-law was longer this time. She told Nathan to remind the old man that his only job was keeping his license active, instructing my son to lock me out of the financial server before the corporate buyers arrived for their site visit. Reading those words felt like breathing in cold ash. My own boy, the child I had carried on my shoulders through this very building, was actively working to isolate me. Nathan was not just turning a blind eye to the missing trust funds, because he was actively helping his wife build a wall around their theft. The bright light of the computer monitor blurred slightly. I took off my reading glasses and pressed the heels of my hands against my tired eyes. A single, hot tear escaped, tracking down the deep lines of my cheek before dropping onto the wooden surface of the desk. 40 years of building a pristine reputation and raising a family had culminated in this quiet, sterile betrayal. A soft knock sounded at the door. Ruth stepped into the office, carrying a fresh cup of black coffee. The office manager stopped halfway across the room, her eyes taking in my slumped posture and the glowing screen on the desk. She did not ask what was wrong, nor did she offer hollow platitudes. Ruth simply walked forward, placed the warm ceramic mug near my hand, and gave my shoulder a firm, grounding squeeze. That simple gesture of loyalty solidified something deep inside my chest. Family pride was a heavy blanket, and I had been suffocating under it for years just to keep the peace. Kendra and Nathan had already destroyed the family, so the only thing left to protect was the truth. I reached for a pen, ready to write down the exact routing numbers from the email attachments, when Ruth spoke in a hushed tone. "Walter," she said, glancing back toward the hallway. "Eleanor Brooks is waiting in the front lobby. She looks terribly upset, and she is holding her husband's prepaid service contract. Eleanor had finalized that contract 5 years ago, trusting us to secure her future. If she was standing in the lobby looking panicked, the financial corruption had already reached our most vulnerable clients." I pushed my chair back and stood up, leaving the coffee untouched. The time for quiet observation had officially ended. The front lobby of the funeral home always smelled of polished brass and fresh lilies, but stepping out of the hallway, I only noticed the trembling hands of Eleanor Brooks. The 73-year-old widow stood near the mahogany reception desk, clutching a faded yellow envelope tightly against her chest. She wore a dark woolen coat buttoned all the way up to her chin, and her eyes were rimmed with angry red circles. "Walter," Eleanor said, her voice cracking over the syllables, "I just received a letter from your billing department, and I do not understand what is happening." Approaching the desk carefully, I offered her a warm cup of water, but she refused it with a quick shake of her head. Instead, the widow reached into her envelope and pulled out a tri-folded sheet of thick paper. She smoothed the document flat on the glass countertop. It was a prepaid funeral contract, dated 5 years ago, bearing the gold foil seal of our family business. My own signature rested at the bottom of the page, right next to the stamp confirming that her husband's final arrangements had been paid in full. "Arthur is in hospice care, and the doctors say we only have a few weeks left," Eleanor whispered, tracing her frail finger over her husband's name. "I called your daughter-in-law this morning to begin the preparations, because we paid for the premium package. Kendra told me the trust account is empty. She said Arthur and I missed our final installments." A cold knot pulled tight in the center of my chest. Eleanor and Arthur Brooks had never missed a payment in their lives, because I had personally accepted their final cashier check 5 years ago. "May I see the letter Kendra sent you?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly, even so I would not frighten her further. Eleanor pushed a crisp white paper across the glass. The printed notice demanded an additional $10,000 to secure the burial plot, claiming that the original funds had been consumed by rising administrative maintenance fees. The bottom of the page bore the corporate logo of Northbridge Operations. "I am so deeply sorry, Eleanor," I told her, placing my hand gently over hers. "There has been a terrible accounting error, and I give you my personal word that Arthur will receive exactly what this contract promises." Ruth stepped out from behind the reception partition, her jaw set in a hard line. The office manager had been listening to the entire exchange. Taking the original receipt, Ruth walked swiftly over to her terminal and began typing. The rapid clatter of the keyboard filled the quiet lobby. "Walter," Ruth said, staring at the glowing monitor. "You need to look at this." I walked behind the desk and looked over her shoulder. The digital ledger for the Brooks Family Trust showed a zero balance, and every single dollar had been systematically transferred out over the past 18 months under the guise of management consulting. Ruth clicked on the master client list, highlighting 3 more prepaid accounts. Those balances had also been completely drained. My family was not just stealing from a faceless corporate buyer, but they were actively robbing vulnerable widows who had trusted the Hayes name to protect them. The weight of that realization pressed down on my shoulders, heavy and suffocating. My own reputation had been used as a shield to deceive our clients. Ruth closed the trust window and opened the shared executive drive, navigating to the folder Kendra had prepared for the corporate acquisition. 2 completely different master spreadsheets sat side by side in the directory. One file showed the devastating truth of the drained client trusts, while the second document, labeled specifically for the buyer, displayed something else entirely. The 2 spreadsheets glowed brightly against the stark white background of the monitor. Ruth clicked open the first file, revealing the devastating internal truth of our company finances. Columns of red numbers documented every single dollar siphoned into Northbridge operations. Then, she opened the second document, which was clearly labeled for the corporate buyer. Assets had been artificially inflated by hundreds of thousands of dollars. Future liabilities, including all of the prepaid client trusts, had been completely erased from the presentation. The corporate investors still knew absolutely nothing about the missing funds. They were preparing to pay millions for a hollowed-out shell of a business, completely unaware that the foundation was built on stolen money. I thanked Ruth quietly and stepped out of the lobby. Walking into the empty employee break room, I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the private number of our outside corporate attorney. David had represented our legal interests for over 20 years, and he always answered on the first ring. "David," I asked, keeping my voice low so the sound would not carry down the hall, "what exactly happens to the acquisition if my qualifying professional license is formally withdrawn from the business before the closing date?" A long pause stretched over the line. The attorney let out a heavy sigh, the sound crackling softly through the receiver. "The buyer would immediately invoke the material adverse change clause," David explained. "State regulations require a licensed director on staff at all times. Without your credentials, the corporate investors would suspend the closing and likely terminate the entire agreement. It would also trigger a mandatory emergency audit within days." Hanging up the phone, a crushing weight settled over my shoulders. Saving my son from prison meant hiding a massive financial crime and abandoning families like the Brooks. Protecting those innocent widows meant intentionally destroying the sale and exposing my own family to criminal ruin. I found Nathan standing in the main viewing parlor. My boy was carefully adjusting a large arrangement of white lilies for an afternoon service. The soft amber lighting caught the silver threads starting to show in his dark hair. "We need to talk about Eleanor Brooks," I told him, holding a printed copy of the fake ledger. "And we need to talk about the missing trust accounts." Nathan froze instantly. The delicate flowers in his hands trembled slightly before he forced himself to set them down on the mahogany stand. He refused to turn around or meet my gaze. "Kendra is handling the bridge loans," my son muttered, smoothing his expensive suit jacket. "Everything will be completely replenished the moment the corporate buyout clears next week." "You do not understand modern corporate finance, Dad. You stole money from grieving widows," I replied, my voice carrying a hard edge that echoed through the vaulted room. "You allowed your wife to drain their protected futures just to fund your personal luxury." My son finally spun around, and his face twisted with sudden, defensive anger. "We are simply trying to secure our own future," Nathan snapped, stepping toward me. "Kendra worked for 3 grueling years to arrange this corporate sale, and we just needed a temporary cash advance. If you say a single word to the buyers, you will ruin us." He defended the very woman who had humiliated me, choosing her greed over our shared integrity. The boy I had raised to respect this solemn profession no longer existed. He was just another desperate accomplice trying to cover his tracks. Turning my back on him without another word, I walked slowly down the long, carpeted hallway toward my office. My son had firmly made his choice, and now I had to make mine. Sitting down at my wooden desk, I pulled a blank state regulatory form from the bottom drawer and picked up my heavy fountain pen. The heavy fountain pen rested cold and heavy in my palm. Black ink flowed smooth and permanent across the official state board withdrawal notice, filling the empty boxes on the thick paper. My printed name anchored the bottom of the page. By adding my signature to that specific line, I voluntarily surrendered the qualifying professional license that kept this entire funeral home legally operational. Folding the document carefully, I slid the crisp pages into a rigid cardboard envelope. Ruth had already called the courier service. The young delivery driver waited patiently by the front reception desk, taking the sealed package from my hands with a polite nod before walking out into the autumn morning. 48 hours crawled by. 2 days of suffocating silence settled over the building, and every time footsteps echoed down the hallway, my chest tightened. Finally, the bulky fax machine in the main administrative office whirred to life. The device spit out a single confirmation letter from the Ohio Regulatory Board. My formal withdrawal had been fully processed and recorded. The corporate buyers did not waste a single moment. Shortly before noon, the multi-line phone on Kendra's desk began ringing incessantly, piercing the quiet atmosphere of the viewing parlors. Nathan burst through my heavy oak door without knocking. A thick blue vein pulsed visibly near his temple, and his expensive suit jacket hung open. "They suspended the closing," my son shouted, slamming a printed email down onto the wooden surface of my desk. "The corporate investors just invoked the Material Adverse Change Clause because the state board notified them about your license. What exactly did you do?" I looked away from the financial ledger and met his furious stare. "I protected the innocent families who trusted us, and I finally stopped letting your wife use my name to steal from them." My boy stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. Those angry eyes stared at me as if a complete stranger was sitting behind the founder's desk. The profound betrayal etched across his face cut deeply into my heart, but I refused to apologize for stopping a massive financial crime. "You completely destroyed us," Nathan whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and panic. He turned his back on me and walked out, leaving the door wide open. The drive home that evening felt significantly longer than usual. Parking my reliable old sedan in the empty driveway, I stepped out into the crisp, late October air. Dead brown autumn leaves scattered across the manicured lawn, tumbling over the cold concrete in the wind. The house was entirely silent. Losing my son's trust was a devastating price to pay, yet leaving innocent widows bankrupt would have cost me my soul. A sharp vibration in my wool coat pocket broke the stillness of the driveway. Ruth was calling from the office, and her voice sounded tight with quiet urgency over the speaker. State regulators had just contacted the front desk to announce a mandatory emergency financial audit, and the forensic accounting investigators were arriving first thing tomorrow morning. 3 forensic auditors arrived precisely at 8 o'clock the following morning, carrying heavy leather briefcases and wearing identical expressions of professional skepticism. They immediately commandeered the main conference room, spreading thick financial binders across the polished mahogany table, and requested unrestricted access to our administrative servers. Kendra barricaded herself inside the executive suite. The frosted glass door remained firmly locked, and the vertical blinds were drawn tight against the hallway windows. Walking past her office, I could clearly hear the frantic clicking of a keyboard and the muffled mechanical whine of a paper shredder running at full capacity. My son's wife was desperately trying to erase the paper trail before the state investigators could find it. Ruth caught my attention from the front reception desk, waving me over with a tense flick of her wrist. The office manager pointed at her computer monitor, noting that the entire local network was crawling at a glacial pace because someone was actively deleting massive amounts of administrative emails and digital ledgers. That panicked cover-up attempt only handed the investigators more ammunition. Months ago, following a brief power outage in the neighborhood, I had authorized an external technology firm to implement daily off-site cloud backups for all our critical records. Kendra completely forgot about that system, or perhaps she never bothered to read the vendor reports. A single phone call to our service provider immediately locked the local administrative accounts, freezing my daughter-in-law out of the network entirely, while the remote technicians began restoring every single deleted file directly to the auditor's secure laptops. Formal interviews started shortly before noon. Thomas walked into the conference room looking pale and exhausted, clutching a thin folder against his chest. Nearly 2 hours passed before he finally emerged. His tie hung crooked, and the color had drained completely from his face. As he crossed the hallway, he paused beside me without making eye contact. "I told her it wasn't legal," he whispered quietly. "I said those trust accounts couldn't be used that way. She told me the sale would close before anyone ever noticed." He swallowed hard. Nathan knew the transfers were happening. He kept saying everything would be restored after the acquisition. Thomas lowered his head before continuing down the hallway toward the exit, looking like a man carrying far more than accounting records. When my own interview finally began, the senior investigator slid a printed timeline across the conference table. His finger traced a line stretching back nearly a decade. Northbridge Operations has existed for 9 years, he said. For most of that time, it barely moved any money. He tapped the final section of the chart. Then, 18 months ago, just as preparations for the corporate acquisition accelerated, the transfers exploded. Then, 18 months ago, just as preparations for the corporate acquisition accelerated, the transfers exploded. Millions of dollars had not disappeared through years of neglect. They had been siphoned away deliberately during the precise period when the company was being polished for sale. The pattern left almost no room for innocent explanation. Raised voices echoed through the normally quiet hallway. Through the partially open door of the viewing parlor, I watched Kendra cornered near the floral displays, frantically waving her hands and trying to blame the missing funds on a series of unfortunate bookkeeping errors. Nathan stood quietly a few feet behind his wife. The confident operations manager who had yelled at me yesterday was completely gone, replaced by a pale, hollowed-out man staring blankly at the carpet. My son was finally realizing that the temporary bridge loan his wife promised was actually a massive, inescapable federal crime, and the corporate buyers were absolutely not going to rescue them. His shoulders slumped, and when our eyes briefly met across the room, I saw genuine fear replacing his previous arrogance. The lead auditor stepped out of the conference room, holding a thick stack of printed evidence, and interrupted the heated argument in the hallway. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and announced that the preliminary forensic report was fully complete. A final, mandatory closing meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock the following morning, and the state regulatory board expected every single executive to be sitting at the table when the absolute truth was laid bare. 10 o'clock arrived with heavy, suffocating tension. The main conference room table was completely covered in thick financial binders and printed email chains. State regulators sat on one side, flanked by the aggressive legal counsel representing the corporate buyers. My son and his wife took the chairs directly across from them. The air in the room felt stagnant, smelling faintly of stale coffee and nervous sweat. Taking my seat at the head of the long table, I placed the original prepaid contract belonging to Eleanor Brooks face down on the polished wood. The lead investigator began the meeting by sliding 2 vastly different ledgers into the center of the table. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and pointed a pen at the glaring discrepancies. One document represented the glowing, artificially inflated numbers provided to the corporate investors. The second spreadsheet displayed the brutal reality of our completely drained family trust accounts. The corporate lawyers leaned forward, their professional expressions hardening as they realized the massive extent of the deception. Kendra leaned closer to the table, her perfectly manicured hands clasped tightly together. My daughter-in-law attempted a practiced, confident smile, casually suggesting the financial discrepancies were merely temporary administrative oversights. She confidently claimed Northbridge Operations was a legitimate consulting vendor chosen by my son to modernize our infrastructure. That specific lie lasted exactly 10 seconds. The regulatory agent opened a manila folder, producing the original state and corporation documents for the shell company. Kendra had registered Northbridge under her own maiden name 9 years ago. The ambient hum of the air conditioning seemed abnormally loud as the entire room grew deathly quiet. To dismantle her final defense, I turned over the widow's contract and pushed it toward the corporate lawyers. Then I handed them copies of the missing trust account balances, alongside the heartless billing notices demanding more money from a grieving woman. The undeniable proof of elder exploitation sat right there under the bright fluorescent lights, extinguishing any remaining hope for the corporate acquisition. Seeing the absolute ruin of her ambitious plans, the chief operating officer turned a desperate gaze toward her husband. She commanded Nathan to explain that the funds were merely a short-term bridge loan. Her voice grew shrill and panicked, demanding he take the blame for the wire transfers to protect their family. My son looked at the fraudulent ledgers, then at the widow's contract, and finally at me. His jaw tightened. For several agonizing seconds, nobody in the room spoke. Kendra kept insisting they could still explain everything away, but Nathan no longer answered her. His breathing became shallow as years of quiet compromise finally collided with the undeniable evidence spread across the table. Slowly, he reached into his tailored suit jacket and removed his unlocked cell phone. His hand hesitated above the polished wood before he finally slid it toward the lead investigator. "Everything is on there," Nathan whispered, his voice breaking. "Every transfer, every instruction, every message." Kendra lunged forward to grab the device, but the regulator pulled it smoothly out of her reach. A heavy, absolute finality settled over the room as the corporate attorneys closed their briefcases in unison. The buyer was officially walking away from the multi-million-dollar deal. Then, shattering the tense silence, my daughter-in-law's cell phone began vibrating loudly against the wooden table. The bright screen illuminated the caller ID, displaying the name of her luxury real estate agent. The massive corporate payout she had banked her entire future on was officially gone. She stared at the vibrating screen, her hands shaking uncontrollably, finally understanding the true cost of treating my name like a disposable asset. The corporate buyer formally terminated the acquisition agreement during the 5th week following our explosive conference room meeting. Reorganizing the funeral home took nearly 3 grueling months, and Ruth stayed late every single evening to help me manually verify the ledger entries. Every stolen dollar was meticulously tracked and restored to the proper trust accounts, ensuring innocent clients like Eleanor Brooks received exactly what they had paid for. The state regulatory board allowed me to maintain my professional license, but restoring the community trust required absolute transparency and endless patience. Criminal charges officially landed in the 3rd month, rapidly dismantling the carefully curated life my daughter-in-law had built. Sentencing concluded in the 11th month of the investigation. Facing severe federal fraud and elder exploitation convictions, the former chief operating officer received a substantial prison term without the possibility of early parole. The $2,800,000 corporate payout she had desperately chased evaporated completely, taking her career, her flawless public image, and her freedom down with it. My son avoided a lengthy prison sentence solely because he surrendered his cell phone and cooperated fully with the state fraud investigators. Filing for divorce became his very first step toward accepting responsibility. Yet, the civil penalties proved absolutely devastating. Marital assets purchased with the misappropriated funds became strictly subject to legal restitution. To satisfy the court-ordered repayments, Nathan had to sell his sprawling luxury estate, liquidate all his personal investments, and hand over the keys to his expensive imported vehicles. He visited my office on a dreary afternoon, looking exhausted and wearing a wrinkled department store suit. Standing awkwardly near the heavy wooden doorway, my boy quietly asked if I could loan him enough money to secure a small apartment lease across town. Looking at the man who had willingly traded our family honor to protect a thief, I felt a deep ache settle behind my ribs, but my answer remained firm. Letting him face the crushing consequences of his own cowardice was the only way he would ever learn to stand on his own feet. I refused the financial rescue, and he accepted the rejection with a slow, heavy nod before walking out into the autumn rain. Late October arrived with a bitter chill, marking exactly 1 year since the scandal completely shattered our family. Crisp brown autumn leaves crunched loudly under my heavy boots as I walked through the quiet cemetery on the edge of Upper Arlington. Stopping in front of a familiar gray granite headstone, I gently placed a fresh bouquet of white lilies near the engraved letters of my late wife. The cold wind brushed past my face, bringing a profound sense of quiet closure. Businesses can be sold. Buildings can be replaced. Money can disappear overnight. But a good name takes an entire lifetime to build, and only a single act of greed to destroy. My son's wife believed the old man sitting quietly in the back office was nothing more than a signature waiting at the bottom of a page. She thought my signature made her rich. She never understood my name was worth far more. When you spend decades building a life based on hard work and unshakable principles, you naturally hope those values will flow down to the next generation. You want to believe that your children and their spouses see the quiet sacrifices you made over the years, rather than just the financial stability those sacrifices eventually produced. But the hardest lesson you will ever have to learn is that sharing a bloodline does not automatically guarantee loyalty, and marrying into a family certainly does not grant someone a moral compass. A true legacy is never about the physical assets you accumulate, the massive houses you buy, or the lucrative businesses you build from the ground up. Your actual legacy is the trust you earn from your community and the unyielding integrity you maintain when no one else is watching. Sometimes, the people standing closest to you will look at your lifetime of quiet dignity and see nothing but a convenient resource waiting to be exploited. They will smile to yoss the table at holiday dinners while secretly viewing your hard-earned reputation as a blank check to fund their own endless greed. When you find yourself standing at that terrible crossroads, discovering that your own flesh and blood has actively chosen a lifestyle of deception over a life of honor, you face an agonizing choice. Society frequently tells you to protect your family at absolutely all costs. We are constantly taught to cover for our children, to absorb the brutal impact of their mistakes, and to sacrifice our own peace just to keep the fragile family unit completely intact. You must realize that enabling a profound betrayal is never an act of love. Covering up a deliberate harm to save a grown child from the devastating consequences of their own choices only destroys your soul, while teaching them that treating innocent people as collateral damage is perfectly acceptable. You have an absolute right to protect the good name you spent an entire lifetime polishing. If someone dismisses you as completely obsolete and demands that you stop calling them, yet they secretly rely on your unblemished record to fund their luxury lifestyle, they are not just taking your money. They are aggressively stealing your identity. The most powerful boundary you can ever set is refusing to let your personal honor serve as a shield for someone else's malice. Pulling your support and refusing to sign the documents that enable their deceit requires a staggering amount of courage. It means accepting that the picture-perfect family you dreamed of is permanently shattered. It means sitting in the quiet aftermath and watching people you love face absolute ruin because you finally stopped catching them when they deliberately decided to jump. The quiet peace that follows the storm never erases the heartbreak, but it reminds you that living with integrity is lighter than living with guilt. You learn that your dignity is not a transferable asset, and your honor is not for sale at any price. True justice does not always require loud shouting matches or bitter acts of revenge. Sometimes, finding justice simply means stepping back, removing the unearned protection you have been providing, and allowing gravity to do the rest. Have you ever found yourself completely caught between protecting a family member and standing up for what is undeniably right? When the people you loved and trusted most tried to use your kindness or your reputation for their own selfish gain, how did you find the strength to finally draw the line and walk away? Please share your story in the comments below, because your quiet courage might be exactly what another listener desperately needs to hear today.